Croeso. Hello and welcome to this asynchronous presentation on activating prior learning. This slideshow includes information and guidance on different types of memory and the crucial role that these play in the process of learning. We will look at approaches and strategies for activating prior learning. This includes, but is not limited to, retrieval practice, also known as the testing effect. It is important that you move through this presentation at a pace which best suits you. Please do pause on any slides which require greater consideration or personal reflection. Equally, you may feel that you would benefit from returning to a previous slide or section as your understanding of the subject deepens. Towards the end of the PowerPoint is a comprehensive bibliography and list of suggested further reading. This section includes links to materials that are freely available online. Thank you for watching. I hope that you find this presentation interesting and helpful. We will begin this presentation by posing two initial questions. Pause this slide and allow yourself some time to reflect on each. You may wish to return to these questions after you have completed this presentation. The information, guidance and range of selected approaches and strategies within this presentation are all robustly evidence-informed, as represented by the top left yellow circle in this Venn diagram. In order to achieve the desired evidence-informed practice, i.e. the overlapping centre of the Venn diagram, it is crucial that you consider the context of your setting, be it the individual, group, cohort, department or school, and the experiences, expertise and professional judgment of the practitioners. There are, for example, many different approaches one may select to leverage the benefits of retrieval practice. However, certain strategies might work better than others in a particular context, at a particular stage in learning, and to elicit a particular desired outcome. What do we mean by activating prior learning? Agarwal and Bain provide the following definition. Now that we have a clear shared definition for activating prior learning, we move on to the question, why is activating prior learning important? Alex Quigley quotes David Ausubel's powerful statement. In order to fully appreciate why activating prior learning is so important, we first need to understand just how learning happens. Peps McRae, in his 2017 text, Memorable Teaching, succinctly sums up the role of memory in learning. The Education Endowment Foundation, in their excellent 2021 review, Cognitive Science Approaches in the Classroom, a review of the evidence, presents the following schematic model of learning. Please do go through this slide at a pace that is right for you. The description and detail will be described on the following slide. The following explanation comes from the same Education Endowment Foundation's review. In summary, memory can be separated out into sensory, working and long-term memory. It is the process of going from seeing or hearing something to storing it in long-term memory, and this involves several stages. An input, for example, hearing a teacher explain multiplication tables, the vast majority of which is forgotten. For example, the background noise, the clothes that the teacher's wearing, what is on the wall behind the teacher. A fraction of this enters the working memory. For example, 2 times 2 equals 4. However, much of this information may also be forgotten. Through attention and rehearsal, the information moves from working memory to the long-term memory. It is encoded. But some of this will be forgotten. Note the rehearsal loop between the working and long-term memories through the process of encoding and retrieval, and then encoding and retrieval. This will become the focus of the presentation shortly. We will look in greater detail at each of these elements. However, it is useful to set out a few key principles immediately. Learning requires information to be committed to long-term memory. Information is processed through the working memory. The working memory has limited capacity and can be easily overloaded. Powley in 2018 and Bain in 2025 offer a slightly simpler version representing this learning process. Prior to step 1 will be the input or stimuli, the sensory memory and attention. These two models of learning shared so far are clear and precise and easy to follow. In reality, however, learning is not so organised and defined. Bain, in 2025, expresses this very clearly. We learn. We forget. We space it. We retrieve. We forget. We space it. We retrieve. Hopefully, the information is stored in the long-term memory permanently. But ultimately, learning is messy. The following images, redrawn from Inner Drive, demonstrate that the working memory is very small, but the long-term memory is far larger. The following descriptions are taken from Inner Drive's The Difference Between Short-Term Working and Long-Term Memory. What is short-term memory? Short-term memory has a very short duration, only storing information for a brief period of time, and research suggests that this number is around 15 to 30 seconds, unless you use rehearsal strategies such as reading the information out loud. After this period of time, the information is either lost or transferred to our long-term memory. What is working memory? We often see the terms working memory and short-term memory used interchangeably. Despite there being an overlap between the two structures, there are a few important differences which make them distinct. Working memory is the type of short-term memory that combines multiple components together and is used to plan and carry out behaviour. It also incorporates information from our long-term memory and applies it to new information. In essence, working memory is a type of short-term memory that is important for higher level cognition. What is long-term memory? For learning to take place, information must be moved from our short-term memory, working memory, to our long-term memory. This type of memory allows us to learn information and has a huge capacity. It also has a massive duration, with memories being stored from a few days to decades. In school, this is probably the most important. This is where information that students will need to retrieve for their exams, for example, will be stored. This diagram, also redrawn from Inner Drive, represents the key role that transfer between long-term memory and working memory play in the learning process. Long-term memory is not simply a storage vault that information can be randomly thrown into. Instead, new memories are linked to old structures called schemas. A schema is a bundle of knowledge, facts, emotions and actions, and we use the schemas to think about the world. Therefore, it is important to be aware that more previous background knowledge that someone has, the easier it will be to take in and remember new knowledge. Agarwal and Bain recognised the sometimes, perhaps often, overlooked crucial aspect of learning: retrieving the learning that pupils have been exposed to previously. This is far more than simply remembering facts or information. It is central to the learning process. We will look at this in greater detail over the following slides. This is another diagram, redrawn from Inner Drive. As described previously, the working memory is very limited. This means that it is very quickly overloaded. It is particularly true for anyone who is new or a novice to the domain of learning. If cognitive load has exceeded its limits, we call this cognitive overload. This state significantly hinders the transfer between the overloaded working memory and the long-term memory. It is important that practitioners understand how to optimize cognitive load, as a greater understanding of cognitive load theory will greatly support practitioners in planning and delivering effective learning opportunities. It is, regrettably, beyond the scope of this presentation to delve more deeply into cognitive load theory. However, the Education Endowment Foundation has created a video providing an excellent overview of cognitive load theory, as well as an overview of the processes of memory. You can access these by clicking on the blue hyperlinks or scanning the QR codes. In the following section, we will expand on the purpose of activating prior learning. Let's start by returning to the quote shared near the start of the presentation by David Ausubel. But what does this mean? Alex Quigley, in his text, Why Learning Fails and What to Do About It, discusses the different reasons why students may fail in their learning. At the heart of this learning failure is patchy prior knowledge. We can, however, overcome this by strengthening the learning and closing the gaps of understanding through meaningful activation of prior learning. It is also important in this context of activating prior learning to understand the difference between learning and performance. There's a fundamental question. How do we really know if a student has learned anything in the classroom? And this is what Soderstrom and Bjork consider the distinction between learning and performance. Learning is the relatively permanent changes in behaviour or knowledge that support long-term retention and transfer, whereas performance is the temporary fluctuations of behaviour or knowledge that are observed and measured during training of instruction or immediately thereafter. As practitioners, we need to recognise and understand this important distinction so that we do not confuse the two and fool ourselves into believing that our pupils have successfully undergone robust learning when they have, in fact, only demonstrated short-term performance. Emma Turner, in her 2023 text, Initium, Cognitive Science and Research-Informed Primary Practice, shares the following excellent example. Today, I could teach you how to make an origami swan. I could show you how to fold the paper. I could explain how to bend and shape it to produce a beautiful final piece. You could make that swan with me today, and we could both congratulate ourselves on a job well done. I taught you how to make the swan. You successfully made the swan. In 6 weeks, I could come back and ask you to make another origami swan. This time, I will not demonstrate or remind you how to make it because I know you can make one. You made me one before. What are the chances that you could successfully make the second swan? The chances of you remembering all the steps in the correct order and managing to reproduce the original swan at a point in time far away from the initial instruction are likely quite slim. Unless you have been practicing the making of the swan every day or have taken up origami as a new hobby, the chances are that you would struggle to replicate the original. If we think about this in terms of teaching, our classrooms and lessons are often brimming with the equivalent of flocks of origami swans. We take the curriculum content, we teach it, we model the content and bring it to life with manipulatives, representations, opportunities to unpick early misconceptions, and we guide pupils to practice and evidence their thinking. Their books and curriculum products will demonstrate that they were proficient in the content, and there may be stickers, stamps and teacher comments in these praising the children's competence and success. But much of this is swans. If we return to those same children 6 weeks later and ask them to remember and reproduce their original successes with accuracy, proficiency and efficiency, how successful or otherwise do you think they might be? Sherrington and Stafford explain the implications of learning versus performance for teachers. In essence, we need to plan for purposeful opportunities for our pupils to revisit, recall and practice what they have previously been exposed to but not necessarily understood or learned. We also need to help to equip our learners in the act of effective recall and practice. Now that we have a clear understanding of why activating learning is crucial, we need to consider how we can do this. We can sort the process of activating prior learning into 2 broad categories. These are recap and rehearsal, and this describes a process of any prior learning being shared with students. For example, a teacher may reintroduce something recently taught and recap the most salient information as bullet points on a whiteboard, or a summary might be shared as a handout for pupils to read through and familiarise themselves with the information. If, through feedback and observation and questioning, it is discovered that students have a poor understanding or have misconceptions, then reteaching is the way to go. The second process of activating prior learning is retrieval practice. Retrieval practice, also known as practice testing or the testing effect, is when the onus is on the learner trying to actively recall or retrieve the learning from memory. It is important to realise that recap and rehearsal and retrieval practice are not better or worse than each other. The better option depends on several factors. 3 of the core factors are summarised on the following 2 slides. Retrieval strength is a measure of how easily recalled something is currently, given what is relevant to the present situation. Does it come to mind now? The retrieval strength of a given piece of information can be high or low, and this can fluctuate back and forth between the values. Retrieval strength is measured by current performance, for example, answering questions in class or during a test. Storage strength is a measure of whether information is deeply embedded or well learned. Is it likely to be recalled later? Barring organic brain damage, storage strength cannot decrease. Rather, it is presumed to only accumulate. Storage strength cannot be directly measured, but it must be inferred. Is that information easily recalled in the future? Or, if you forget that information, does it become faster to relearn the next time? Tom Sherrington provides a clear summary of recapping and rehearsal. He explains that the first stages of learning a new concept involve creating a set of connections that allow us to make meaning from the elements that make up the concept, linking them together and binding them to knowledge that we already have. Forming these connections require some short-term rehearsal, establishing a unit of knowledge that is stable and coherent enough that we can later retrieve it. If we don't establish a basic level of stability and coherence, there is nothing secure enough for us to retrieve. Sherrington continues, retrieval practice is better suited later in the learning process, following the initial introduction or instruction and periods of teacher-led recapping and rehearsal. Let's take this opportunity to recap, in summary, the roles of recapping and rehearsal and that of retrieval practice. In the following section, we will look in detail at retrieval practice, also known as practice testing. First, let's briefly recap and revisit an earlier slide. A crucial takeaway point here is that the onus is on the learner to attempt to recall previously learnt information from their long-term memory. Why use retrieval practice? The reason for using retrieval practice is that the very act of retrieving helps to strengthen the memory of that learning. More specifically, it strengthens both the storage strength and the retrieval strength of that memorised learning. We will look at storage strength and retrieval strength a little later. The process of retrieving also helps the learner to make links between the previously learnt materials and new material, i.e. the schema of learning is developed and strengthened. Importantly, it also provides feedback both to the student and to the teacher about what the student is able to remember and, depending on the type of retrieval practice used, what the student can understand. It is crucial that both student and teacher acts upon the feedback. For example, is the memory patchy? Is it too early for true retrieval practice? Should there instead have been the opportunity for teacher-led recapping or reteaching? Bradley Bush et al. From Inner Drive share 6 benefits to retrieval practice, helpfully represented as simple diagrams. If we pause and reflect for a moment about retrieval practice, we know what retrieval practice is and we know the benefits. But what information should we expect our students to be retrieving? Weinstein et al. Provide the following. A key consideration when implementing retrieval practice approaches should be how to determine the optimal task difficulty. If pupils are unable to retrieve information successfully, then it is unlikely to increase memory strength. However, the evidence is currently uncertain about the optimal level of challenge. The Goldilocks principle provides an excellent starting point, i.e. not too easy and not too hard, but just right. Robert Bjork includes retrieval practice and space practice, which we will look at shortly, as 2 of the desirable difficulties, i.e. these approaches should be challenging but achievable, and this challenge has a greater impact on memory retention. So when in a lesson should we use retrieval practice? Jade Pierce, in conversation with Bradley Bush of Inner Drive, argues that teachers should not be compelled to incorporate retrieval practice solely at the start of a lesson, as this will then remove the teacher's professional judgment about what is the best way to start the given lesson. She provides a range of scenarios to clarify this point. For example, when reteaching something not successfully understood from the previous lesson is the better option to take. Her message is that it is good practice to incorporate retrieval practice, but at the appropriate time within lessons, and to use the approaches consistently. We have covered the what, the why, and the when of using retrieval practice. In this section, we will look at the how. Before we focus on specific strategies and approaches, it is important to reiterate here that retrieval practice should never be a high-stakes, anxiety-inducing event. Rather, it is a strategy to aid learning. This fundamental underlying purpose should be communicated to and clearly understood by our students. There are numerous strategies and approaches for retrieval practice. The two resources linked on this slide each provide a good summary of some of the more popular approaches. If you are considering purchasing any textbooks on this subject, Kate Jones has written a series of excellent books which are published by John Catt, and these are included in the bibliography and recommended further reading at the end of the presentation, along with other texts. Kate describes a broad range of strategies, such as finish the answer, list it, label it, retrieval pyramids, and retrieval placemats. Mark Anderson and Ollie Lewis, in their publication, The EdTech Playbook, describe a series of tech tools that can be leveraged to support retrieval practice. Anderson and Lewis also emphasise a key point. It is not about the tool that you use to support retrieval practice. How you incorporate it to facilitate the retrieval is the important thing. Therefore, when planning to engage our students in retrieval practice, we should start by reflecting on its purpose and what we want the outcome to be. We should then consider the likely best approach that we should take in order to achieve this outcome. Beware lethal mutations. In the context of education, a lethal mutation is a well-intentioned educational practice or idea, when implemented, becomes ineffective or even harmful due to misapplication or misunderstanding. It's like a good idea gone wrong, where the original principles are diluted or twisted to the point of being unproductive or detrimental to learning. Applied to retrieval practice, mandating that all classes adopt a particular strategy at a particular point within every lesson, regardless of whether this is a good idea or good timing, would be such an example of lethal mutation. Instead of adopting an unwavering conformity and uniformity in every lesson across every class at all times, we should instead consider a number of related factors, not least whether retrieval practice itself is the appropriate way to go. Perhaps recapping or reteaching is preferable. Tom Sherrington, echoing J. Pearce from an earlier slide, eloquently describes his concerns with imposing a rigid approach to retrieval practice. A final recap of recapping and rehearsal and retrieving practice. If you wish to explore this in greater detail, click the hyperlink or scan the QR code on this slide. Kate Jones, in conversation with Craig Barton, discusses the need to consider whether retrieval practice is the right approach or if recapping and rehearsal is preferable. The following slides explore the effect of combinations of weak or strong retrieval strength and storage strength, and the implications that these have for teachers. The diagrams and the incorporated text have been adapted from Craig Barton's textbook, Tips for Teachers, 400 plus ideas to improve your teaching. These following slides are animated in order to aid in clarity. However, there remains a considerable amount of information. Please progress at a pace which is best for you. You may, for example, wish to pause the slide after each section to reflect on the information shared. In the previous slide, we identified that Zone B is where we ultimately want our students to be. This animated diagram on this slide and the next describes the pathways from each of these other zones to that of Zone B. In their guest post, the learning scientists provide an example to help us better understand the zones resulting from the interplay between retrieval strength and storage strength. For example, if you're on holiday, your hotel room number will be easy to remember while you're staying at that hotel. That's high retrieval strength, but it is not actually well learned in the sense that you'll remember it a long time from now. So there's low storage strength. Conversely, your childhood home telephone number that your parents made you memorise may be very well learned, high storage strength, but difficult to recall in the moment because it's been a long time since you've had to think about it. Low retrieval strength. Storage strength underlines the main goal of learning and teaching. We want our students to learn information, not so that they can parrot it back to us immediately, but so this information is easily recalled in the future, in whatever situation it is needed. In this section, we will consider when to use retrieval practice. Not with regards to timing within any given lesson, we've discussed that already, but rather how long the gap should be between the initial teaching and any subsequent retrieval practice events. To understand the importance of purposely building in extended gaps between retrieval practice events, what we refer to as spaced practice, it is helpful to begin by looking at Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. Hermann Ebbinghaus was a German psychologist, and he derived this curve in the 1880s. So what does this curve show? The curve shows a rapid loss of information from memory in the immediate aftermath of the learning experience. That is, if we do nothing to try to change this loss of information. The forgetting curve cannot tell us exactly what rate of retention will be for your students generally, or for a specific student at time A or time B for a specific topic that you've taught. There are individual differences and factors in the learning environment, like how much attention students are paying and how new the student is to the information. There are differences in content too, whether it's abstract or complex ideas or simpler and more concrete. This version of the forgetting curve includes the effects of purposeful retrieval practice events that have been spaced out as a series of events over time. In this version of the forgetting curve, we see the impact of spacing the retrieval practice out over different periods of time. This is called spaced practice, sometimes referred to as distributed practice or spaced learning. Firth and Rysat, in their text, What Teachers Need to Know About Memory, summarise this by explaining that the graph demonstrates that through spacing retrieval sessions out over time, information can be retained over a number of weeks. If this is successfully achieved, we can be reasonably confident that it will still be accessible to learners after months or even years. They say that as educators, what happens in those first few days may be crucial to allow this to happen. So in summary, the forgetting curve tells us the following. As soon as you learn something, you begin forgetting it almost immediately. The rate of forgetting is often shockingly high. A few hours after learning something, people routinely remember only a small fraction of it. Each time you practice recalling what you know, the rate and the amount of loss is reduced somewhat. Retrieving something back into working memory slows the rate of forgetting, but how and when retrieval practice takes place is important. Craig Barton suggests that we should share the forgetting curve with our students and explain the purpose and the value of spacing retrieval practice out. If you wish to watch this video, please click on the hyperlink or scan the QR code. we've established that spacing out retrieval practice is important. So in this section, we will look at the timescales. It is clear that spacing out purposeful episodes of retrieval practice greatly increases the likelihood that a learner retains the information within their long-term memory. But what should the timescales of these spaced practice events be? Is there an optimum amount of time, for example? Pepys-McCrae describes the ideal scenario where retrieval practice occurs just before the learner forgets the information. The following quote echoes that. But it is likely to prove very difficult for teachers and for the learners themselves to know exactly what time this is. So instead, could we use a simple formula? For example, could we arrange spaced retrieval practice to occur after, say, 1 day, then 1 week, then 1 month, then 3 months? The answer, as I'm sure you would expect, is that there is no simple hard and fast rule for optimising spaced retrieval practice. Bradley Bush and Edward Watson of Inner Drive explain that the length of time between the spaced practice is dependent upon several factors, and these include the amount that the learner already knows and how long we want the learner to retain the information. The longer you want the student to remember the information, the longer the spacing gap needs to be between revisiting the material. Bruce Robertson, in his text Power Up Your Pedagogy, the Illustrated Handbook of Teaching, describes a further consideration when planning for effective spaced retrieval practice. That is, as the timescale between each retrieval practice increases, perhaps from a day-to-day to a weekly scale to a monthly scale and beyond, it is probable, or in fact highly likely, that the breadth of content that is reviewed and retrieved will also increase. So as a result, it is likely that the retrieval practice event will require more lesson time. This needs to be considered. These spaced practice sessions are sometimes considered as daily reviews, weekly reviews and monthly reviews. These are terms that Barak Rosenshine includes within his Principles of Instruction. In this final section, we'll briefly consider the crucial element of ensuring that we establish the best conditions and classroom environment for effective retrieval practice to become embedded and utilised optimally. How successful retrieval practice is likely to be begins with establishing a supportive and effective learning environment. This includes developing a positive, trusting relationship between practitioners and pupils, and establishing routines and structures so that students know and understand the expectations placed upon them. It is also crucial to remember that retrieval practice is a learning strategy and not an assessment tool. And as explained earlier, this needs to be communicated to and understood by our learners. Perhaps sharing Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve is a great way of helping to explain this. Bush et al., in their text Teaching and Learning Illuminated, The Big Ideas Illustrated, provide a diagram that has been annotated here that summarises the creation of the right conditions for effective retrieval practice. The following slides summarise 3 of the main points from this presentation. These final slides bring activating prior learning into the planned sequence of learning. For this to be truly effective, opportunities need to be purposefully and carefully planned and suitably spaced out as part of the planned and designed curriculum. By doing this, we will enable our students to more firmly embed their learning, to make links with new information, and develop their schemas, resulting in a more rigorous and robust understanding, which ultimately leads to meaningful and lasting progress. We also need to remember when to reteach something or recap and review it before we focus solely on retrieval. We have covered a considerable amount in this presentation. It is likely that you were unable to take in all of the information, so why not plan to revisit and recap this in a few days' time and perhaps in a few weeks' time. However, from what you are currently able to recall, why not consider what the main takeaways of this presentation are for you? As we draw this presentation to a close, it only remains for me to say diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you for taking part. I will leave you with this slide. What will you do next? Pob luck, good luck. And remember that there is a comprehensive bibliography and suggested further reading section at the end of this presentation.